All these people are interested in Stoicism? What are you, nuts?
Scientists are not more objective than other people.
It's not a question of suppressing emotions.
Why do we have such a hard time convincing people of things that appear to be pretty obvious?
So you define yourself as a skeptic, or you're one of the, you join the skeptics camp. How do you define that, and what does it mean for the way you live your day-to-day life?
So skepticism means different things to different people. It started out actually as a philosophy of life back in ancient Greece. And the skeptics, the ancient skeptics, thought that the way to live a good life was simply to suspend judgment, not to attach yourself to any opinion. That way, imagine that. If you actually can manage that, you have no political opinions. Nobody's going to be after you because you're on the right or the left or the center or whatever. So they thought that this was the way to have peace of mind in life. And since they also argued that there really is no way for human beings to know anything for sure, then it was a sort of interesting, coherent philosophy. Modern skepticism means something different. It is very much related with to the reactions against pseudoscience. It is very much a movement in support of scientific education. So a modern skeptic would be somebody who, ideally at least, investigates phenomena that are outside of the normal purview of science, UFOs, astrology, parapsychology, things like that. Things that scientists themselves probably won't be bothered to do. With the intention to figure out if there is in fact anything behind these things. I prefer to think of modern skeptics as people who are generally open-minded about the possibility of paranormal or strange phenomena, but that really want to see the evidence and seriously look at what the claims are and whether they stand up to scrutiny. Usually they don't. That's the problem.
So are you a modern skeptic or an ancient skeptic?
I'm a modern skeptic. My philosophy of life leans more towards Stoicism than skepticism in terms of ancient philosophies. I do think the ancient skeptics were an interesting bunch, and they had a number of interesting points. They do inform modern skepticism because we do retain this notion that knowledge, proof is a very high standard that almost never reached in reality. Even in science, when people say, oh, there's a scientific proof of something, well, usually scientists don't prove things. Mathematicians are more in the business of proving. Scientists can provide evidence, but evidence can be faulty, evidence can be provisional. Scientific theories may be supported up to a certain point and then abandoned. So the modern view of human knowledge is, in a sense, more skeptical. That is, we really are aware of the limitations even of science.
All right, so what's the problem that we're going to talk about in the next few minutes? Well, this is the simple version of the problem. Astrology over here, astronomy over there. Pseudoscience, science. If you have trouble with this, I think you're in the wrong place. Okay? But that's the problem. The problem is, how do we tell them apart? I mean, why is it that at least in some cases, we can say, yeah, this is really not science. Whatever it is, it's not science. And in other cases, we can say, yeah, sure, of course it is. And then what happens in between? Are there situations where you kind of, you go like this? As you'll see in a minute, there are. The second question is, why do we care? Right? What's the practical import of all of this? Well, I think that there are three major answers to why we care about what philosophers of science refer to as a demarcation problem. How to delineate, to separate science from non-science, and in particular, science from pseudoscience. Right? But you can see the problem is actually very old. How do we know? How do we trust? If you're not a physician, how do you make up your mind about whether to go to the quack or what other people say is a quack, as opposed to what other people say is a physician? Turns out philosophers have thought about this for quite a while. One of them is Alvin Goldman, and he has proposed a 5-level test for finding a trustworthy expert. I'm going to walk you through the 5 levels of the test. This is very useful. If you get anything out of this talk, please get this slide, okay? Not as it is now, as it will develop in the next few minutes. And then I'll give you a application to a real case, okay? This is truly useful. You can go home now, from now on, and have a ready-made tool for determining if you want to trust somebody who claims to be an expert or not. I'm not claiming infallibility to the tool, but I'm claiming that it's much better than what most people normally do. First question, examine the arguments presented by the alleged expert and her rivals. That's great, except that this does run into Socrates' problem. That is, in order to examine the arguments, you actually have to be an expert yourself. If you are, great, right? So if you are an economist, then you should definitely put your own opinion out there about economics, but not about other stuff if you don't understand it. 2, look for evidence of agreement among experts. If there is a consensus among experts, chances are that's your best bet. Now, agreement among experts doesn't mean that the experts never get it wrong. Yes, we all know that 500 years ago, allegedly, every expert thought that the Earth was flat and not round. Actually, that's not true. Astronomers have known that the Earth was round since the ancient Greeks. But setting that aside, yes, the experts can be wrong. Even a consensus among experts can be wrong. The question is, yeah, but have you got anything better? It's a question of where do you put your money? Okay? Where are you going to bring your money when it's a matter of things that actually are important? 3, look for evidence that expert is in fact an expert. When you go to your doctor, you notice, I mean, at least in the United States it works this way, they have a lot of diplomas on the wall. And the more diplomas they have, and the more from prestigious universities, the better you feel about the doctor, right? If it turns out that, oh, wow, she's got a diploma from Columbia and then another one from Oxford, it's like, crap, this is good. If it's got a diploma from the University of I don't know what, you're going to say, wait a minute, hold on. Does this woman or man know actually what they're doing? So you should check for whether the expert is in fact an expert. You can do that actually fairly easily these days. You can check up, on websites, the background, the publication records, all sorts of stuff. Number 4, investigate what sorts of biases the expert may have. Experts are biased because every human being is biased. We all have agendas, we all have interests, we all have opinions. But some opinions and some biases are worse than others. So if your doctor keeps prescribing you the same drug and it turns out that he actually gets money from that particular pharmaceutical company, you might want to ask for a second opinion. Okay? It doesn't mean that that's not a good choice, because a lot of these drugs actually do work and they do what they're supposed to do, but you should be inquiring into, well, what happens to doctors that don't get money from that pharmaceutical industry? Do they actually prescribe something else? And number 5, check the track record of the expert. I mean, if he's an expert, presumably he was right more time than not. If you have a problem with your car, you go to a mechanic, but if a mechanic keeps give you back the car and it's not fixed, at some point you're going to say, you know what, I'm going to look for another mechanic. Right? The track record is important. Financial advisors have a horrible track record. This is actually established. There's research on this stuff. Okay, they don't do any better than chance in the long run. They may succeed at one point or another, but they don't do much better than average, than random. Okay, so here's an example. Should I vaccinate my kids? And we're going to pit your doctor against Jenny McCarthy, who is a famous model and actress who knows nothing about medicine, or at least does not have a track record in medicine. So here's I'm going to have the 5 criteria forced by Goldman, and then we're going to compare your physician against Jenny McCarthy. Arguments. Jenny McCarthy's argument is, my science is my child, which is not a good argument. This is a direct quote. That's why it's in scare quotes. Your physician, presumably, even though she might not do directly medical research, presumably she keeps up with the medical literature and knows about ongoing studies being published about, for instance, the vaccine-autism connection. Is there agreement among experts? No, in the case of Jenny McCarthy. Yes, in the case of your physician. Yes, so essentially anyone who has done studies on vaccines and autism agrees that there is no problem. Is the expert an expert? No, yes. So if we were keeping scores right now, we're getting a nice football match, we're 3-0 in favor of your doctor. Is there bias? Well, I think in this case, they both could be charged, reasonably charged with biases. Jenny McCarthy, of course, she's probably genuinely concerned about her child. There might be also an effect due to the fact that, being famous and having a sense of a mission in order to, help other people, those could all play into the psychology of the person, understandably, but they can bias the behavior. On the other hand, your physician, as I just mentioned a minute ago, possibly gets money on incentives from big pharma, and therefore she's also biased. So that's a draw. We're still 3-0. There's no track record here of successful predictions or anything about medicine. Yes, there is presumably a track record there, otherwise she wouldn't be a doctor, and otherwise she wouldn't have patients. So the result is, we're counting 4-0 in favor of your doctor. That's a rout in football, right? It's like, okay, you're done.
So as a modern skeptic, when you looked at certain ideas that are maybe not mainstream scientific ideas, more kind of paranormal beliefs or kind of reflections on those kind of experiences, was there, you said most of them don't stand up to scrutiny, but were there any that did?
That's a good question. Historically, yes. It depends on how you look at things. But for instance, alchemy today is considered a pseudoscience, because if you think that you can actually turn lead into gold or something like that, you're seriously mistaken. But at some point in the past, alchemy was taken seriously until a few centuries ago. Well, then it mutated, in a sense, into what we today call modern chemistry, right? So the alchemists, the successful alchemists became chemists, and chemistry is certainly a science. So that kind of claim stood up. The alchemists actually did discover things about what we would today call the chemistry of elements, although their core idea was in fact mistaken. So there are examples in the history of science where certain fields start out in a kind of a sketchy position, and then they either evolve into pseudoscience, they sort of devolve, I should say, or they evolve into science. I mean, think about it. The other obvious example is the fact that until several centuries ago, there was no sharp distinction between astronomy and astrology. There is today, but Ptolemy was just as much an astronomer as an astrologer, and that went on for most of the Middle Ages. And then only gradually people realized that there was some good stuff to keep. That's what we today call astronomy, and some stuff that didn't work out. And that's what we think of astrology. Even very famous scientists got involved at some point or another with what we would today call pseudoscience. I mean, Newton is arguably one of the most famous and the geniuses of science of all time. Turns out he spent more time studying alchemy and doing biblical criticism of all things than physics. But we remember him today as a physicist because the physics part worked and the alchemy and biblical criticism didn't work. So,
are there any contemporary examples from contemporary science that you think is more pseudoscience or is slightly problematic?
There's a number of areas of modern science that are problematic, but that's the nature of science, I think. So, for instance, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI. It's done by scientists. It's done by using very expensive instrumentation, radio telescopes usually. It's definitely not a pseudoscience, but it's not quite science, is it? We have no data at all. We haven't found a single case so far, so the sample size is n equals 0. The theory is a little bit shaky and optimistic. Basically, he said that researchers simply assume that there are beings out there that have a similar psychology to our own and want to communicate with us. So it's a little bit, I wouldn't consider it a mainstream science. It's kind of one of those borderline cases. Evolutionary psychology is another one. So the notion that human behavior evolved is pretty sound. That's part of standard evolutionary biology. But when you try to apply directly evolutionary theory to modern human behaviors, such as gender differences, for instance, then that becomes much more problematic because it's difficult to do the appropriate tests. The data are difficult to gather. It's easy to speculate and to come up with hypotheses that, however, are not necessarily standing up to scrutiny. So evolutionary psychology is another one of those things that is right in between. And depending on future development over the next decade or so, we may talk about it as an established science down the line, or as something that actually devolved into pseudoscience. In less recent, but not too distant past, things like eugenics or phrenology, both of those were considered scientific when they had their heyday, and then eventually, both of them were sort of dismissed as not working, and from a scientific perspective. And then if people insist in pushing them, then that's when the word pseudoscience comes up. Pseudoscience doesn't refer to something that is wrong, to an idea that it's wrong, because there's plenty of ideas in science that turn out to be wrong.
Like what?
Oh, like every theory in physics before the current one. And probably the current one is also at least incomplete, so in some sense it's wrong. By current one, I mean quantum mechanics, which at the moment is the most established scientific idea of all times, but physicists already know that it's incomplete. So that's why they're searching for the next iteration. So the difference between science and pseudoscience doesn't lie in the fact that one is right and the other one is wrong. That's actually a common misconception, both in the public in general, and sometimes even among skeptics. The real difference is in the methods, and the real difference is in the fact that once you get a negative result, you accept it. And you say, well, okay, that didn't work, so we're going to set it aside. If there are negative results showing very clearly and consistently that an idea didn't work, and yet the proponents of that idea insist that it is a good one, that's when they begin to slide into pseudoscience. I mean, pseudoscientists, they don't use that term, but pseudoscientists have the same trappings of science. They publish journals, they have conferences, they look at empirical evidence, sometimes they do statistical analysis. So from the outside, to a person who doesn't know better, it looks like they're doing science. But if you're doing that kind of things with a notion that it's been clearly discredited, then that to me is arguably the best definition of pseudoscience.
Why do we have such a hard time convincing people of things that appear to be pretty obvious? Such as astrology doesn't work, vaccines don't cause autism, Brexit, a bad idea. Oh, I'm sorry, that was... I didn't mean to get into politics. Okay, why? Well, I think that the answer comes all the way back from Aristotle. Aristotle wrote a book on rhetoric. Rhetoric has a very bad sort of reputation these days, like it's what lawyers do to convince people of things that are not true. But in fact, rhetoric is the art of persuasion. If we're talking about talking to other people, we actually want to persuade other people. And Aristotle studied this in quite a bit of detail, and he said there are three components to actually be persuasive with somebody else. One is what he called the logos. You have to have your facts straight, and your reasoning correct. Because otherwise, you're a sophist. You're just selling hot air. Okay? You have to have the stuff right. Now, most scientists and science popularizers stop there. That's the only thing they get. When they talk to other people, when they write for other people, when they are in debates or things like that, that's the only thing they care. I got my facts straight, I got my reasoning correct, that's it. Every sensible human being should therefore be convinced. They apparently don't know anything about human beings, because that's not enough to convince people. What else is necessary? The ethos. You need to establish your trust and your authority. And I don't mean by that just, oh, I got a PhD. That's, lots of people have PhDs. That's not enough. You have to establish your trust with the people, with the audience that you're talking to. Okay? Back in Tennessee, years and years ago, I did a number of debates against creationists. And one of them, Dwayne Gish, I noticed started out a debate by talking about the local football team and the local quarterback, American football. I said, what the hell is he doing? He's wasting time, precious time. He's not putting forth arguments or facts on behalf of his position. He was establishing ethos. You say, you can trust me. I'm one of you guys. Okay? I'm talking your language. Politicians do that all the time. Unfortunately, most politicians don't get the logos correct. And finally, pathos. Pathos means emotional involvement. You have to make people understand that this stuff actually matters to them directly. If you make the wrong decision about vaccines, your kid is going to die or is going to get sick. Okay? Or your friends' kids are going to die or get sick. It has to matter. Otherwise, people don't see the relevance to this thing. Unfortunately, pathos emotional involvement is anathema to scientists. Scientists are trained as a career to stay as much as possible away from emotional involvement, and that's their big mistake. Okay? So in order to, in fact, talk to people in a reasonable way, you have to have all three components. Aristotle was right. And a lot of the problem that we have, even individually, I'm not talking just about scientists, even when you talk to your friends or your relatives, is that often you use arguments and facts, but you neglect the other two. Or you downplay the other two, and you're not getting anywhere with that.
Moving on to Stoicism, how did you turn towards this philosophy as a kind of philosophy for life?
Midlife crisis, which I'm told pretty much everybody goes through at some point or another. Yeah, it was a period in life where things were going not too well personally, and even from the point of view of my profession, it seemed like I had hit a little bit of a quiet zone where, yeah, I was doing my job and it was doing fine, but it wasn't anything that was particularly novel or exciting or something like that. So those are the period in life where you sort of, if you can afford it, you can stop and think about stuff and say, where am I going to go from there? Now, since I was beginning to study philosophy professionally, because up until that time, I was actually a professional biologist, I switched to philosophy at about that time. Once you start studying philosophy at the graduate level, in my case, but even I think at pretty much any level, you can't avoid start thinking about sort of the big picture. And so, you read Plato, for instance, or you read a book on ethics or something, and you say, oh, that's interesting. Where do I fit in with this? So that kind of started a quest to explore different possible options, and I looked at a number of possible philosophies of life. The philosophy of life, by the way, is nothing mysterious. It's just a combination of two things, a metaphysics and an ethics. A metaphysics is essentially an account of how the world works, and an ethics is an account of how you should behave in the world. If you define it that way, then every religion is also a philosophy of life. Right? So I grew up Catholic, for instance. And Catholicism gives you metaphysics. It tells you that the world was originated by a God, and that the God decides what goes on in the world. That's a metaphysics. And then it tells you, an ethics. It tells you go to church on Sundays because you want to learn how to be a better person. Right? So those two characteristics are common between, among all religions and philosophies of life. So I looked at a number of them, explored them, including Buddhism, including 2 or 3 different ancient Greek Roman philosophies. And I was in the middle of this thing, and then one day on Twitter, of all places, I saw this thing that said, help us celebrate Stoic Week. And I said, what the hell is Stoic Week, and why would anyone want to celebrate it? I remember the Stoics from high school, but I didn't really remember much about them other than they're supposed to suppress emotions and go through life with a stiff upper lip, which turned out not to be true. Those are both stereotypes, but hey, that's what I remember. But I was curious, so I signed up. Turns out that Stoic Week is an annual event, which happens every fall, is organized by an international group of scholars, philosophers, historians, and cognitive behavioral therapists, because it turns out that Stoicism has influenced the development of CBT in the 1950s and 60s. So there are certain kinds of psychotherapy that actually originated, at least, with inspiration from the Stoics. So I did it for a week. It really clicked. It's in like I started reading the Stoics, and I started practicing their meditations and their exercises, and it really clicked. So I committed for another couple of months until the end of the year, and then I committed for another year. And then here we are 5 years later. I wrote 2 books about it, and I still do it.
All these people are interested in Stoicism? What are you, nuts? The Epicureans are meeting around the corner, by the way. I know, right? They have free drinks. No, just kidding. So first, the basics. Stoicism started out about near the end of the 4th century before the modern era. In Athens, the guy that established the philosophy was Zeno of Citium. Zeno was actually a merchant, and he lost everything that he had in a shipwreck
right outside of Athens. He made it to the city. And of course, what would be the first thing you did if you just lost everything in life? You walked to a bookstore. That's what he did. And if you walk to a bookstore, what happens? Well, you hear the owner of the bookstore reading out a book about philosophy. And in particular, in that case, the Memorabilia, which is a book by Xenophon about the life of Socrates. So Zeno was very interested, and he asked the bookseller, he says, like, where can I get me one of these, meaning a philosopher? And the bookseller said, over there. There is one just walking by, because that was ancient Athens. You know, people were walking by, and chances are that they were philosophers. The guy in question, it's a different world. You know, it was a different world. The guy in question was Crates of Thebes. He was a Cynic philosopher. Cynicism didn't mean what it means today. In fact, many interesting English words, Cynic, Skeptic, Stoic, and Epicurean, don't mean what they meant in ancient Greece. And that could be a whole interesting talk right there, but I'm not going to do it now. So Zeno started studying first with Crates, then with other teachers, and eventually he felt confident enough to sort of start teaching on his own. And he started doing that in public in a place called the Stoa Poikile, which means the painted porch, right in the middle of the market near the Agora in central Athens. And that's why the philosophy is called Stoicism, because it started out in the Stoa. So Stoas were public markets, public colonnades where people would gather. So Stoicism from the beginning was for the people. They were interested in talking to the people that were just walking by, as opposed to most of the other schools, which established themselves in the suburbs outside of Athens so that they wouldn't be bothered by people unless they were really interested. So that's how it started. The basic assumption of Stoicism is that we should live life according to nature. Now, before you run into the forest naked and start hugging trees, that's not what it means. There's nothing wrong with doing that. If you want to do it, go ahead. But that's not Stoicism. Living according to nature means that we should take seriously human nature in order to decide what kind of life we want to live. Because otherwise, after all, we are in fact human beings. We're not lions, we're not chimpanzees, we're not something else. So there are certain things that work for human beings because of the nature of humanity, or what it means to be human. Now, of course, different people have different ideas about what it means to be human. The whole concept of human nature has been under discussion in both science and philosophy for literally 2,000 years. The Stoics had this notion, however, that there are two fundamental components to being human that trump everything else. One is that we're eminently social animals. We're not the only social animals, obviously. There are other social primates, there are social insects, and so on. But we are fundamentally social. We can survive on our own if we have to, but even for long periods of time. But in fact, we thrive only in social groups. We seek recognition, we seek affection, we seek relationships with other people. So that is a fundamental component of a good human life. The second thing that distinguishes human beings is the ability to reason, to a far greater extent than any other species on Earth. We can have a whole separate discussion, I'm a biologist, we can have a whole separate discussion about the extent to which other species are capable of reasoning or not, but hey, it's just us here. I don't see any chimpanzees discussing philosophy at the moment. So we definitely have an ability to reason far above and beyond anything else on planet Earth. Now, whether we use it well and we use it often, that's a whole different thing, but we are capable of it. So from those two things, according to the Stoics, it follows that a good human life, a human life that is worth living, the Greek word is eudaimonia, consists of using reason to improve society. So to be helpful to other people and to yourself by applying your ability to reason. Okay? So that's pretty much what Stoicism tries to do, to improve people, to make people better at using their reasoning abilities and use them not for their own selfish motives, but in order to make everybody better, to make the planet a better place. The notion is that because we're so interdependent, whenever you help other people, you're helping yourself. And whenever you try to become a better person, you're automatically helping other people around you.
What's one of your dearest kind of rules or Stoic ideas that have really helped you?
The fundamental one that has made a major difference in my life, and it does affect the life of pretty much anybody who practices Stoicism, is something called the dichotomy of control. The Stoics believe that everything you do can be partitioned into two components. One part that is really up to you, where you really have control, and another part that is not up to you, where you don't have control or complete control, because the outcome depends on external factors. And a fundamental tenet of Stoic philosophy is that you should focus all your energy on the part that is under your control, and then develop an attitude of equanimity toward the second component. Sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. But it's not a reflection of who you are, it's a reflection of the fact that the universe works in strange ways. So let me give you a specific example. Let's say that tomorrow you're up for a job interview. And the normal thing to do would be to be anxious and say, I really want this job, and I'm really going to hope that I get it, and so on. That's normal. The Stoic would approach in this way. It's like, well, tomorrow I have a job interview. Did I do everything that is in my power up to this point to prepare for the interview? Yes. Am I focused at the beginning of the interview? Yes. Do I know what I'm talking about? Yes. That's it. Done. Then how the interview goes, it's not really up to you. It depends on your competition. It depends on who the interviewer is, and whether he got up in the morning and on a strange mood or whatever. And the fact that even if you get the job, you shouldn't, according to the Stoics, you shouldn't feel too cocky, because part of it is a result of your efforts, but part of it is you just got lucky. And similarly, however, if you don't get the interview, you shouldn't beat yourself up, because again, it's not under your control. If you did everything you could, that's all that it's under your control. So that really does help. I think that essentially it in modern terms is the basic notion is to internalize your goals. Right? So I just mentioned the job interview. Let's say that a common thought is, if you're in a relationship, I hope she loves me. No, I hope to be a loving person, because that's under your control. Whether she loves you back, it's up to her. I hope that this friend is going to really be a good friend. Well, you can be a good friend. That's under your control. Whether other people are going to be good friends to you or not, it's not. And so on and so forth. So you can apply it pretty much everywhere. And once you start practicing that way and looking at things that way, you just calm down, because you say, well, I'm going to accept whatever happens, so long as I know that I've done the best that I could.
2 final questions. So does that mean that basically you have a continuous dialogue in your head? So one voice is the kind of anxious, irrational voice saying, oh my God, but I really want this interview. And then the Stoic within you says, you've done everything you could.
Right.
Is that what happens in the Stoic's brain?
That's right. And in fact, that's also a technique that is used in cognitive behavioral therapy to challenge your own thoughts, challenge your own perceptions. Epictetus was one of the major Stoic philosophers from the 2nd century, and he has this beautiful way of expressing these thoughts. He said that we should look at our impressions. An impression in Stoic terminology is your initial opinion about something. So for instance, that, oh my gosh, I have the interview and this is stressful. This is a stressful situation. That's an opinion. That's expressing an opinion. Well, who is expressing the opinion? The interview is just a fact of life. It's not, the interview doesn't come with opinions. You are expressing that opinion. And so you can challenge yourself and say, wait a minute, why am I thinking this way? Why not try to think about things in a different way? And that actually does work. There is pretty good empirical evidence that it's not a silver bullet. So it's not like you start doing this tonight and then all of a sudden your life is fine. But if you do it on a regular basis, you learn to challenge your own impressions, your own opinion, your own judgments. Then little by little, it will become easier and easier. And at some point, you'll stop having those kind of distressing. That's where the stereotype of the lack of emotion comes from. It's not a question of suppressing emotions. It's a question of controlling and interacting with your negative thoughts.
So my position is that, first of all, we should ask separate questions. One, is there really a problem? Two, what really the problem is? And 3, do we have some reasonable scientific ideas as opposed to non-scientific ideas for solving the problem? And so the first thing is, do we have a problem? Maybe. The fine-tuning problem is often posed in terms of, well, isn't it an amazing coincidence that we have all these constants that just happen to produce a universe like the one that we have, where complexities arises and where life is arising, and then, of course, out of life, we're here discussing philosophy and physics. I think that the better way of phrasing the problem is actually more basic, which is we don't know what constraints, if anything, the fundamental laws and constants in physics. That is the real question. I think that the anthropic part of it is a destruction. And frankly, I guess unlike you, I do think that it's a destruction that comes out of the fact that we've got these cosmic-sized egos as human beings, like oh, it has to be about us for some reason. I think it's really misleading way of putting the question. The real question is, we have laws of physics, we have a number of parameters that seems to be fixed within those laws. Why? Why is it that they have those particular, regardless of whether those particular parameters then bring about Homo sapiens or dinosaurs or whatever it is? I mean, this is a world mostly of bacteria, so one could actually reasonably argue from a biological perspective that this whole fine-tuning was so that bacteria can have a feast on planet Earth, right? So that's the first issue, that I think that we should really get away from these anthropic stuff altogether. The second issue, in terms of, well, so why do we have these parameters that are set this way somehow? One possibility is the God stuff, as you say. That's clearly metaphysics of a particular type of the theological metaphysics. There are actually other options, even within metaphysics, that don't require sort of a transcendental God. There is the simulation hypothesis, for instance. This is the idea that we're all playing in a video game, actually we're all characters in a video game, and somebody set up the parameters of this video game, the laws of physics and the fine-tuning stuff. It's actually really the parameters of a video game, and somebody's doing this thing. And there's actually a really interesting argument for why this is not as crazy as it sounds. Although that to me doesn't sound that different from God, because after all, a video gamer who is capable of producing the entire universe, and I can't distinguish that from God. And then there are and then there are these scientific or at least scientific sounding answers that we're going to get into in a few minutes. And there the question is, really, is it science, or how much is it science, or what is our hope to make it transition from interesting speculation to actual science? But I'd like to also eventually get to this point in the discussion and say, when we say that these parameters are fine-tuned, or however you want to put it, we're sort of making an assumption that the parameter space is in fact essentially infinite and flat. That is, that the distribution of these parameters is in fact nothing like a bell curve or a very, very spiky looking thing. It's just flat and goes on forever. In other words, that really, I don't know, the gravitational constant, let's say, in theory could take any value whatsoever. So if that's true, then the probability that it would take that particular value is in fact 1 over infinity, which is negligibly small, and therefore now we have a problem. But we don't know that. We don't know from what distributional statistical distributions or underlying distributions these variables and these parameters are actually taken from. For all we know, it could very well be that there is only one possible value for these parameters, or maybe that there is a small number of values, or maybe that the distribution looks something like a triangle like this, or whatever. We have no idea. And of course, one of the things that physicists have been trying to do for a while, coming up with a so-called theory of everything, which is another example of large egos at play, it's precisely to tell an answer to that question, right? So, actually, as it turns out, these parameters cannot take an infinite number of values. They can only take a certain number of values. And if it is a small number of values, then it's really no longer a particular surprise or a particular miracle that we got what we got. So we don't have an answer to those kinds of questions now. We're going to hear about a couple of answers, possible answers now. But when you go through this process, I think you should still keep in mind, A, what the real question is, which is the particular, why do we have the laws of physics basically that we have? And B, that perhaps we're just starting the whole discussion from on the wrong footing, that is, by assuming that it could take, that these numbers could take any value, when in fact it might not, they might not. The first thing I want to make clear is, for myself at least, as both a philosopher of science and a scientist, there simply is no such thing as science without empirical evidence. Now, we can discuss what is the relationship between empirical evidence and theory. We can discuss whether, at one point, a theory becomes not particularly interesting as a research program because it's not yielding anything that can be tested. All of those things can be negotiated, and they need to be negotiated by the properly competent scientific community. I'm a biologist. I'm not going to tell the string theorists, well, you waited long enough, dudes, move on, right? They're going to be the ones to decide when that time has arrived. But I think that it is simply non-negotiable that empirical evidence, there's no science without empirical evidence, and there's no science more particularly without a good match between the empirical evidence and the theory. But that's one of the things that probably will be to have to flesh out. Now, often we have this issue of, scientists, or some scientists at least, are dogmatic. Well, yes and no. There's two ways of looking at the issue of dogmatism here. On the one hand, there are certain things that have been so well established and so well understood that, yeah, I'm going to be dogmatic about it. If somebody tells me, Darwin was fundamentally wrong, natural selection is not a real process in nature, I'm just not even going to look at that person, because that is something that has been established over 150 years plus of experimental results, theory, and so on and so forth. I'm simply not, I don't have the time to renegotiate it. Okay? But if you're telling me, well, I don't think string theory is well established, then sure, of course, yes, that's true. And in fact, the relevant epistemic community, that is the fundamental theories themselves, are actually not in agreement on what's going on there, so I'm going to wait until they figured it out. So that's one sense in which scientists can be dogmatic. The other sense is scientists can be dogmatic in the sense that they can be resistant to new ideas, and sometimes improperly so. Or maybe they can push their own agenda, their own ideas, and in a way that it's inappropriate. Well, welcome to the world. I mean, scientists are human beings. Whatever makes anybody think that scientists are different, qualitatively from the rest of humanity, I mean, that seems to be a mistaken idea. Scientists are not more objective than other people. They're certainly not more, somehow capable of deciding what the truth is about their own theories. They have their own biases. We all do. The way, however, science works, and it works reasonably well, at least we haven't figured out a better way of investigating nature so far, is that science is done by a community of people. And these people have, the more varied their cultural background, gender, politics, and whatever it is, the better science comes out. Okay? Just to give you a trivial example, until not that long ago, a lot of medical research was done only on middle-aged white men, because the people that were doing the research were middle-aged white men. Then it turns out that certain aspects of human physiology are in fact significantly different for women, or are significantly different for people with different ethnic backgrounds. But that came to the fore and was corrected only once we started having enough women or enough ethnic minorities involved in the process of science, and people started looking at it and said, wait a minute, you're missing here half of the picture, you're missing a quarter of the picture. Right? That's the way it works. We haven't figured out a better way of doing it yet at the moment. Is science the only path to knowledge? That depends on what you mean by knowledge. I think it is the only path to serious understanding of the natural world. We don't have any other way. We haven't figured out any other way of doing it. You can try mystical insights, just sit in your room and think about the universe, and you won't come up with anything worth coming up with. I am a philosopher. I can do a lot of armchair philosophizing, but I will not be discovering new facts about the world that way. However, if by knowledge you mean something broader, like understanding, because as it's just been pointed out, but it's one thing is the facts, and the other thing is the understanding of those facts. The theories are actually supposed to articulate an understanding of things. So understanding is broader than just than just science. So we can have other disciplines contributing to it, in particular in this case, I think philosophy of science, epistemology, even cognitive science, because cognitive scientists are the ones that actually point out the cognitive biases that scientists themselves suffer from as human beings and therefore can be addressed. Finally, are there limits to science? Because sometimes you hear these old things about, oh, but science is a limited enterprise. Yes, of course it is. It's a human enterprise. It's done by fallible human beings. It's done by human beings that are smart, but up to a point. We can understand, process information, and so on and so forth, only up to a point in a certain way. And not only that, but we are clearly defined in the way in which we think by our particular cultural background and historical moment. Okay? The reason both Darwin and Wallace came up with the metaphor of natural selection, because the theory is, as far as we can tell, correct, and it describes the way the world is. But the metaphor of natural selection came out of the specific background of Victorian England. Okay? It had been done at another time in another culture, they would have come up with a different metaphor, a different way of looking at things. That's true everywhere, all the time. If anybody, including any scientist, thinks that they can transcend their own cultural milieu, they're just fooling themselves.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.